Double Fine hasn't exactly gained a lot of goodwill from the gaming community lately. While Broken Age started with a good first act, it sorta ran out of steam and most likely funds for its second act. Space-based DF9 failed to actually deliver all the feature set that it promised to people, and Massive Chalice, well, you probably don't remember Massive Chalice, as well you shouldn't, because it was pretty forgettable as a whole. But with all of their projects, there's always a glimmer of brilliance hidden within their work, just like Psychonauts. Now, it may not be obvious at first to everyone, but there's always signs of some really talented people that are involved in their projects, and Headlander is definitely no exception to that rule. Headlander is a comedic Metroidvania game that released on Steam, the Humble Bundle Store, and the PlayStation 4 on July 26, 2016 for $19.99. It oozes style like all Double Fine games do. But here's the question. Did Double Fine use their noggins in creating a game that will keep you entertained throughout your playthrough? Or will the Headlander put style ahead of gameplay once again, and make the game suffer in the process? Just like how I'll make you suffer with bad head-related puns throughout this video. I'd say I'm sorry, but I'm really not. Anyway, that's what I'm here to find out. But before I begin, this key was obtained from evolve.pr for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? Let's start with the story. You are an unnamed character who wakes up in a creepy and unknown lab. The thing is, you end up waking up without something that you would expect. The entirety of your body. Basically, you were the one that people were talking about when the phrase, "I'd lose my head if it weren't attached to my body," was said. Regardless, this is the future, and you're one of the only organic creatures left. Everyone else in this universe has had their consciousness uploaded to robots. They try to build a reason behind why that was, which boiled down to for the survival of the human race. But this is a typical dystopian storyline here. You've got an oppressive AI that's in control of the universe. It's become tyrannical, forcing fellow robots and AI to work well past their effectiveness. Any sort of resistance from these workers is squashed immediately. This leads to a rebel force led by Crystal 9 to fight for the rights of robot kind, as well as attempting to keep the last remnants of humanity alive. Now look, you've probably seen this plot before, because, well, it's been done several times before in this very form. But if you're thinking that this story is weak based on that description, you'd be wrong. That's because the story's execution is done rather well. First of all, Double Fine's history within the point-and-click genre shows up rather nicely here. The writing is one of the game's primary strengths, despite its subject matter being rather rooted in the sci-fi genre's primary tropes. There's a playfulness to these characters that keep within their personalities, and yet add depth and dimension to them while dropping jokes left and right. Now, these jokes can hit and miss, but I found the hit rate to be reasonable. Enough that I could get over the headache inducers. In particular, our friendly neighborhood guide and narrator Earl does a great job of giving you commentary that adds some southern charm to the game's events. His descriptions of what you have to do next and what has occurred were always welcome, as they put storytelling at the forefront. Now okay, you're saying, Dragnix, if there's a story, then there's storytelling. That's why it's called storytelling. You're a dingus. And despite the fact that yes, I am a dingus at times, that's not what I'm referring to here. See, there's dictation and then there's storytelling. There's stories that give you a series of events that happen and try to give you motivation and character through those events. But when trying to give the gamer the information about the story, it's done in a style that's very similar to a chemistry lab report. Here's input X, here's expected output Y. It's so mechanical in nature that it loses any sort of flair while doing it. That's what I call dictation, where the emotion sort of doesn't exist. Storytelling to me comes with flair, the ability to describe a situation and add life to it through the use of specific wording and phrasing. It allows for a player's imagination to add to the character, picturing who that person would be in real life, and add to the colorful language that's being used. Want an example of that? Sure, Earl within Headlander. Earlier, I described Earl as Southern, and yet, even if I didn't hear the voice actor that portrayed him, I could piece together that he was Southern even without being specifically told it. Sure, that may be stereotypical in terms of analysis, but it helps give a definition to the character in question. The game just gave me a canvas to work with his character, and filled in some of the parts. My mind, it did the rest. And to me, that's good storytelling, or at least a basis for it. Double Fine has always been fantastic at one thing in my mind: world building. They've always been a great example of taking material and creating a world that makes you want to explore it, and Headlander is no exception. It's the little details here, as minor recurring characters such as the security doors drop colored puns time and time again that not only are effective in getting a laugh due to a stupid pun, but actually craft a world that's literally not taking you seriously as you try to reach your goal. Needless to say, Headlander's storytelling is definitely one of its strongest attributes, and it helps prop up the weaker parts of the game. You want to see what these characters have to say next, and it keeps your motivation to keep exploring this dark and yet interesting world. But part of the reason why the game's story is so effective is its presentation. Let me be frank here. The game's art direction can be quite striking at times. Double Fine has always had a talented art team, and it shows once again within the halls of Headlander. Now look, it's not the most technically impressive by any sort of means, and several of the textures at times can be rather fuzzy and feel somewhere between the last generation and today's in terms of console graphic expectations. But what the game lacks in technical prowess, it makes up for in style. The cutscenes always had that playful element within them, giving your head a smirk or an interesting facial expression, while adding to the scene in question. It's the ability for the game to present a feeling, like nausea when the head of your character is stuck spinning as your escape pod goes spiraling into the reaches of space. Or it's when the in-game characters end up taking down a new enemy and high-five in celebration, giving you a feeling of accomplishment. In terms of non-cutscenes, there's some standout background work here, like when you're flying through a large number of light bulbs. The uneasiness created into wondering why you're flying through a graveyard of electronics, wondering why some of them are still able to light up, and what exactly happened here. Or it's the obvious symbolism that the game goes for, as you attempt to grab a head to unlock a door. And can't help that the game is making obvious penis symbolism. No, seriously game, you couldn't be more blatant here if you tried. So the game oozes style, and it's a delight to look at. Mostly. There's just one tiny itsy bitsy problem. Some of the visuals can be way too busy, which ends up hurting the sections of the gameplay. The game's different dungeons, if you really want to call them that, all have different themes to them, and the game definitely keeps to those artistic themes rather well. The problem is that it can go too far, as the colors of the hippie and psychedelic levels, for example, can really strain the eyes at times. Even in some of the more normal levels, some of the colors end up blending in with each other and don't help in giving the proper definition to your character. In fact, a lot of levels overdo it with the light in the background. It's the bright oranges and the neon whites that draw so much attention due to their density in the screen. Your eyes are naturally drawn to it, and when your small, little robotic character is such a tiny part of the screen at that point, it's really hard to focus on him. Moving on to sound, once again the Double Fine team knows how to help sell its presentation, but luckily, it also knows how to complement the gameplay as well. The sizzle of an electric floor as you run across it gives you clues of what's around the corner, while the distinct sounds of laser fire warn you that hey, there may be lasers coming your way. All the sounds have clear definition and don't fight the game's music at any point. It's rather well done. Take a listen. In addition, the voice acting in the game is on point, and don't think that you'll just hear them in the game's cutscenes. The game regularly has your main guide talking in your ear, explaining one thing that you need to do next, or just commenting on the situation at hand. In fact, a lot of the voice acting here is done well, matching the character and the themes of the moment. As I mentioned in the story section, it's done with flair, and the voice actors here are talented enough to add inflection and depth to their performances. It definitely enhanced the storytelling, and is one of the game's highlights overall.
Store AI. Red security clearance required for entry. That uniform is really more of a dusty rose.
Just shoot the door. Your red laser will do the trick.
Fine, red access confirmed. Why do I even bother being thorough?
As to music, well, if you were expecting 70s or 80s sci-fi music, you pretty much got what you wanted in Headlander. You'll get the thoughts of the unknown with the mysterious chimes that play throughout the gameplay. Odd instruments are thrown in here effectively, such as the chimes of what appears to sound like a xylophone. And of course, you get your standard keyboard elements, as it feels like it's one of the staples of the sci-fi genre in terms of music. Take a listen and make a determination for yourself. Finally, let's go to where my core fears were going into this review, the gameplay. And parts of those fears ended up being justified, as it's probably the weakest of the main three elements here. Now, as I mentioned before, the game is a Metroidvania game, which means you'll have exploration parts, combat parts, and a few puzzle elements thrown in there for good measure. Oh, and a lot of secret areas to find. Almost to the point where they aren't secret anymore, because they feel like you run across them more commonly than a Double Fine fan saying that Psychonauts should have sold better. That's a rant for another day. Basically, the gameplay has a formula. The guide Earl will give you some missions that you'll have to do in order to make progress in the fight against the Sentinels of the game. These missions vary from having to align satellites to make contact, to having to download valuable data from the enemy. Actually, when I use the word vary, I've got to be very, very careful, because while there's definitely different missions within the game's core, it really all comes back to one simple formula. Activate X amount of switches, where the switches are all of different forms. Once you've done that, you'll move on to the next section, if there isn't a boss fight stuck within the middle. Now, as I mentioned, you're just a head that has to make it in this terrifying and dangerous sci-fi world. As a head, you can fly around with minor restrictions, but you'll quickly find that you won't be able to make a lot of progress. That's because the primary exploration hurdle that the game throws at you is colored doors. I'll get more into this in a bit, but you won't be able to get through any door as a head by yourself. But luckily, you've got a way to deal with that. See, if you wanted a set of gameplay to suck, Headlander has you covered. That's because one of your primary skills is the ability to become a Hoover vacuum and use it to gain access to new areas, or bodies. Yes, you'll be able to take off the heads of other robots and then attach yourself to that robot to use it for your own purposes. I admit, this is definitely a different gameplay mechanic, and one that I loved. The speed in which you were able to fly around, attempting to dodge enemy lasers as they flailed at you when you got close to their head as you popped them off, was pretty damn fun. It always gave a feeling of satisfaction as you pop their head off and then just leave their bodies to pull off the next head in succession. Now eventually you'll have to ground yourself to those robots that you take the heads of, so you can get through the colored doors based on who you took over. In terms of variety here, You've got your basic robots, your puncher robots, and robots with more lasers than the USS Enterprise. In terms of their weaponry, most combat robots have a color assigned to them on the Roy G. Biv scale. The higher up on that chart, the more damage and doors that robot can open. Overall, you do get a good selection of different abilities from these robots, especially when the game goes truly unique. Like with the Knight robot, who fires his laser like you'd see a knight move on a chessboard. As to the combat itself, this is where things start to take a turn for Headlander. Control-wise, the game does a reasonable job on both the PC and the controller. You get more accuracy when using the mouse, as you can aim with a cursor on the screen, but I always prefer the controller for movement when it comes to this game. Both are functional, but there are some drawbacks here when moving around and firing. In particular, one thing you'll have to get used to is aiming and firing and switching directions. When you are in the process of aiming, you strafe as opposed to changing directions if you move in the opposite direction of where you're pointing. So when you get into a room and want to react to a threat right away, if you hit the change direction and aiming buttons at the same time, you may get different results depending on which button you precisely hit first. To me, it felt too Metroid-y for this particular gameplay and level design, as the amount of times you needed to turn quickly and fire didn't complement the control section. Yes, it's a Metroidvania game, but they come in different flavors. It feels like this is a clash of flavors. Anyway, the regular combat will have you firing and using cover to take out enemies. This comes in a variety of forms, some being Rambo style as you hit the fire button constantly, hoping to outdamage your enemies. Other times, the game slows down, as you'll need pinpoint accuracy by firing against a wall to reflect the laser to hit an enemy off screen. There's variety that develops on multiple levels here, thanks to changes in the enemies, level design, and abilities that you get. But in those different combat scenarios, a problem develops. Difficulty. Sure, if you're attached to a robot and it takes too much damage, it blows up. But your head is still perfectly fine, so you can just go on to the next robot. Now, if your head takes too much damage, you do die. And I did die a little bit in gameplay at times, although the game spawns you right at the room that you just entered and died in. The consequences for dying in this game is rather low, and in a Metroidvania genre game, that's a mistake. See, technique in combat isn't really required. I ran through sections with reckless abandon, not really caring about the damage I took, and usually got through them. Even if there were 10 to 20 enemies, I never was really frightened of what the game threw at me due to a lack of consequences. I wasn't afraid of death and having to backtrack and refine things. In fact, in some scenarios, I just walked or went right past the enemies without taking any damage. Now for some people that will be fine, but for others, you'll be bored quickly thanks to it. Now I will admit that somewhat changes with boss fight at times, like with the White Queen fight, where you have to deal with the introduction of an alternate mechanic in order to kill her. But boss fights in this game are relatively rare at the point I got to, so it only did so much. Basically, the game lacks oomph in the combat. It was more of an annoyance more than something I really wanted to be actively a part of. Sure, once in a while the game would throw something new, and it got a tiny bit exciting again. But in terms of keeping up the pace of gameplay, it just couldn't do it over the long haul. What the game relies on in terms of gameplay is less about the combat, and more about the exploration. This somewhat ties into the presentation and storytelling as well, seeing what more the game will offer in terms of visuals and jokes. In addition, the game gives you every incentive to explore every part of the map, whether it be to complete a side quest that is given to you, or finding another hidden upgrade. Moving around the environment is fun, and so exploration is fun because of that. There's an X factor to the exploration element here that works, as getting through sections is not always straightforward. Finding a set of lasers that you'll need to get through, and knowing that you can only take so much damage, then realizing you have an ability that can make that easy for you to get through it. When it comes to natural exploring, Headlander succeeds in the Metroidvania genre. But once again, mostly. Now I will say that the map at times can be misleading, especially when there's no symbols for local teleporters. Trying to figure out how to get to a certain area and not having that info, it turned that exploration into a chore at times. I've already discovered this location, why isn't that info already available to me? On the other hand, sometimes the game gives you too much information, especially in the puzzle elements of the game. For example, the chess portion of the game. You had to have certain chess pieces upload and download data at specific stations. However, you knew the location of specific stations to begin with. In this case, it would be nice to know the station's locations, but not what specifically that station was needing, a pawn, a rook, etc. Instead, it became a gameplay chore, and only really proceeds to pad out the gameplay. Overall, gameplay is a mixed bag here, with good elements and mechanics in there, but sometimes they are organized in such a nonsensical way that it doesn't really help the game in the long run. Now, before I get to my conclusion, I'm going to take a moment here and call out another reviewer. I know, not the appropriate place to do it, but when searching for any performance problems and things that I missed after doing my script, I ran across IGN's review of this game. The IGN reviewer said the following about Headlander's combat. When it's not a classic, slower-paced Metroidvania-style adventure, it's a twitchy bullet hell shooter with enough speed to make your palms sweat. It's a lot to take in. Okay. Yes, there are a lot of lasers on screen at times, but bullet hell is about patterns, precise reaction times, and overwhelming odds that you can get through with precision. A good example of a bullet hell mechanic in a Metroidvania game would be Rabby Ribby, as the boss fights are centered around it. But Headlander is not at all comparable to a bullet hell game. At all. If you're going to use that comparison, at least play the genre you're talking about before you make that comparison, because I'm pretty sure you haven't. Or people who love that genre are going to get the wrong idea about this game's strengths. In the end, Headlander lives on its story and its presentation. It's the strongest draw of the game by far, and it can help make up for the lacking gameplay difficulty. The game creates an atmosphere where you keep wanting to push forward as you get more engulfed into the events and having a smile on your face while doing it. But like most Double Fine games, gameplay is where the game struggles to shine, despite this variation having some reasonably unique mechanics and reasonable strengths at times. Basically, Headlander is for those who love the exploration portion of the Metroidvania genre. If you're looking for combat that's going to test your might, or puzzles that will have you bashing your head against the desk, it's not here. If you're expecting something like AM2R, the Metroid fan project, or even a stylized Castlevania, you're setting your expectations way too high. But if you're expecting the love child of Double Fine's storytelling and style, mixed in with the gameplay of a slightly underwhelming Metroidvania game, then this game is for you. As always, check for multiple opinions using something like OpenCritic, because hey, I'm just one reviewer. Just don't read IGN's review. It sucks. Yes, I'm calling out IGN's review. Anyway, I'll see you on Overwatch Friday, where I'll give you guys a bit of a surprise for the channel going forward. Later. Thanks for watching. Like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe if you want more content like this. In the description below, you'll find the Steam review accompanying this vid, along with social media that you can follow me on, Twitter, Google+, and Facebook groups. And if you want to support the channel, click that Patreon on the left of the screen. And remember, keep on gaming.